Hi folks, Tony Argyle here from the Expat Chat podcast. Today we are live blabbing and we are with Anisa Mohammed. Hello Anisa, how are you?
Hi, Tony. How are you?
Great to have you here. Now the topic of today's conversation is the future of work, why purpose will be greater than place. And really, I'm going to get you to introduce yourself properly, Anisa. But basically, in simple terms, you work with a lot of companies, many Fortune 500 companies, planning the future of workspace and how that's changing. Is that the best way to sum it up?
That's a great way to sum it up. Thank you.
Well, I've done a better job of it than I thought I would. I was expecting you to start telling everybody more detail. But just give us a bit of a background of how long you've been doing it for and how you got involved in that and some of the companies you've worked with.
Sure. So my background's in social science, economics, and I was working in finance in Midtown Manhattan. And I made a career pivot and went to design school. And professionally, I've been doing workplace strategy, which is where you really understand the user requirements for organizations when you're planning their new office space. So in terms of how many meeting rooms, how do they meet? Do they have clients? Are they client facing? So I've been doing that for almost a decade now. And some of my clients have been across sectors, Discovery Channel, big pharma, major law firms, worked with Amazon here in Seattle, as well as some of them are confidential, but yeah, some big clients.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I guess basically the biggest factor, in 10 years you'll have noticed a huge change, I'm sure, in workspace requirements, but I guess the internet's been the biggest factor driving it. Is that fair to say?
The internet, technology in general. So the internet, cloud for certain, was a lot less paper than there used to be, as well as the ability, and we'll get more into this, but yeah, technology.
Okay. Well, the reason we're talking with you today, for those of you who aren't familiar with our podcast, is the Expat Chat. You'll find us at theexpatchat.com. You'll find us on iTunes. Basically, we speak to or interview people who have left the conventional 9-to-5 environment for a new life overseas, often for a fraction of the cost of their old life. And the reason we've got Anisa on the conversation today is really to explore the possibilities that there are out there now in terms of workplace relocation, because we often talk to people who have gone overseas, they've started a new business, and there's so many different ways in which people can earn a living. But taking their own job with them is actually becoming an increasing option for many people. In fact, we've recently brought out the Expat Chat magazine. You can find out more details about that on our website. But our cover story is about Jackie Manchillo, who moved from Chicago to Costa Rica. Now, Jackie thought she'd have to leave her job to do that. And when she went to resign, her bosses said, no, take the job with you. So she's now doing the exact same job she was doing in PR before in Chicago. And has moved to Costa Rica and is loving her new lifestyle while keeping the old employment. And the advantage of that, of course, is a huge reduction in the costs of living while maintaining her income. So there's a lot of opportunities around that, and that's why we wanted to speak with Anisa today. So it's really about exploring those options and making people more aware of the fact that there is a changing workplace environment. So, Anisa, what's some of the biggest shifts you've seen taking place with respect to office space?
As I mentioned before, definitely less paper. So it used to be that people were tethered to their workplace because they had a dedicated machine. They had paper that they relied on for reference. And increasingly, we are using more mobile devices than ever before. We are storing information in the cloud. We really don't. The primary reasons for having to go into an office are less now. And the main one is collaboration, as in terms of what exists. And that's something I think technology is also making huge leaps in helping us get over, as you can see right now. Yeah.
Are we going to reach a point in time where basically workspaces are going to disappear altogether, do you think?
I don't know if I can say that yet. I guess it depends on how far out we're talking, but I think there are two factors that are working in that direction. I'm not convinced yet that I'll ever not need a workplace, because we are humans after all, and interaction is important to a lot of people. But I think that the need for physical space is going to definitely diminish. I think there's an entire industry, right, based on this. So it's a tricky conversation right now.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, I guess, if we're talking about a reduction in office space, that's going to have a lot of consequences to other industries, isn't it? I mean, the price of real estate real estate generally, architecture. There's so many other industries that will impact. Is that something you see happening in the near future, that maybe, the urban environment as we have come to get used to is going to change? Because at the moment, obviously, that we're still growing as an urban society. People are still moving to cities. Cities are still getting bigger. Is that process going to reverse?
I think it's going to plateau. We are having, conversations in major cities across the country are housing affordability, the number of people that are moving into city areas because they want to avoid that commute. A lot of that tension comes from this perception that we need to be physically where we work. And I'm starting to believe that that's a false assumption, that those things have changed, those conditions have changed. So yes, I think there are going to be major implications for cities and planners.
Okay. Well, there's two sides to the story, I guess. Firstly, there's the employee side of it, and I think most employees, given the opportunity to not work in an office environment, would be happy to embrace it. But the other side is obviously the employers, the businesses concerned. Where are they at with regards to this? Are most of them embracing the concept of staff working away from the office, or is there still barriers to that?
I would say that there are. We're making huge advances in that area. I think we've never had more generations in the workplace as we have right now. We have a lot of baby boomers that are not retiring, and we have a lot of a very big young generation that's in the workforce and very tech savvy. So in terms of the barriers, I think a lot of it has to do with people's inability to learn new skills across an organization. So what it means when you want to make a shift like this, where you're not relying on physical space to manage, it affects how you manage people. It affects how you get your work done. And that's, that's a change management. That's a big transformational shift for an organization. So I think those are the biggest barriers, but not insurmountable by any means.
Okay. If anybody wants to ask any questions at all, if you're online, there's a chat window down the right-hand side. Feel free to type them in. I, for some reason, cannot see that chat window today. I don't know what's happening with Blab there, but I know Anisa can. So feel free to type any questions in for Anisa as you go through with that. I guess that is a mental thing for a lot of people, isn't it? I mean, the technology is pretty much there to let people work anywhere. But do you think the biggest barrier at the moment is overcoming that mental perception of the old way of living, the old way of working?
I think that's a big one. I think it's also a lot of companies now, data security. So the idea that you're able to manage that with confidence is important. But yeah, I think a lot of it's behavioral, because technology has been able to solve a lot of things for us so far. So I think that this shouldn't be a big one. A lot of it's our own personal habits.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you what's the fears for companies, and you've just touched on one there, is security, and I guess that's probably the biggest worries out there. And it seems to me that hacking is becoming more and more of an issue. Is that perhaps the biggest barrier to this, the ability to deal with that?
I think that's a big one. I think data security, depending on the industry, I've worked with clients in the federal government and DoD, and in terms of security, that's top. So but again, just to notice the pattern, we're talking less and less about physical space and about all of the other aspects of work, which I think is the key point here. So it's about how do you secure your networks and build them, and what does that mean if it's distributed? Do all of your employees, what were they to be all remote, have their own machines? How does that get managed? What countries, are we talking about when you're talking about international travel, things like that?
Okay. Well, let's put this in a actual perspective. Have you got some examples you can give us of the types of situations you've seen change? Maybe companies where there's been staff who have moved, or any particular job stories, maybe like the Jackie Minchillo one I mentioned. Have you got any examples like that you can share with us of how this is actually playing out in reality for people?
Yeah, I can actually. So we've seen there have been some law firms, for example, and I think it's really interesting because we talk a lot about tech, but we can look at high value yielders, I guess you could say, people who make a lot of money and are highly valued in their organization. There are two law firms in the UK that have recently, they don't have an office. Deloitte Consulting in Canada, just their most recent design is not a physical office. And what it is, it's it's actually all hot tasking, actually. So no one has assigned space and you go in as needed, but consultants are with clients most of the time and that's where they need to be. So, yeah.
So in that case, they're actually physically at their client's works as opposed to working from home, or are they working part from home, part from the client's place?
Part from home, they can be working from anywhere. They're just not assigned to the need to have all of your workers in one place together. That beehive, that's a desire for activity, but that's not necessarily, it's not justified in everyone's work. So law firms and I think consulting are the two areas where we're seeing that most, where it behooves you to be somewhere else. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I know you were speaking shortly at a conference in Asia. You might be able to tell us a bit more details about that. I know it's a conference being run by Hubud, and it's basically the co-working unconference, I should call it. As part of your discussion there, you're talking about the future of what's going to be happening, and obviously we've touched on technologies, but you also talk about people's personal sense of purpose as being a driver for this. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, in my meetings with employees across all of these organizations, and this has been hundreds, and this is across the organization in terms of rank. So it's also senior management and the most junior folks. There's a deep concern for engagement, right? When you talk to organizations now in our economy now, having the top talent is acknowledged as the competitive edge. The better your people, the better you're going to be. So in highly competitive talent markets, if your people aren't engaged, you're in jeopardy. And what we're noticing is that purposeful work is important. Technology has really automated a lot of things that we consider meaningful. So you have more people that are doing work that that's not personal to them. So I think you're seeing that in co-working spaces. When you walk into a co-working space, there's energy, there is buzz, there is a lot of, there's a sense of purpose and mission in a lot of those folks. And in my mind, from what I'm seeing within the conventional built spaces, a lot of the employees that my clients want are in co-working. They're the ones working in co-working spaces because they have a deep sense of mission and purpose. So what I'm trying to do is really understand, how do we align that? Because increasingly, I think yeah.
I guess it's interesting what you say there, because people obviously may be heading more towards co-working spaces like Hubud and other organisations like that. That's going to have a positive, I guess, because people will suddenly be working alongside people in totally different industries doing totally different things, but there'll be the feed-off of learning from that. I guess the downside becomes confidentiality. You don't, if you're sitting in an environment like that where there's people all around you who have nothing to do with your company, it's going to become increasingly difficult to protect that. Is that perhaps the positives and the negatives of co-working spaces?
I think that's some of them. And I think to add to that, I think, I would not be surprised to see organizations move towards a distributed model where they might have satellites. And that might be something so that they're almost running their own co-working spaces, as opposed if there's a heavy security need, or they're going to be contracting. I mean, a co-working membership is almost a third what an organization pays for their actual dedicated space for an employee. So, I mean, on many different fronts, co-working makes a lot of sense for organizations, but we really have to get through the mental barrier of physically managing people and not, managing work, not the people. And things like that. And I think we'll get there. So
that's interesting what you say there. Co-working space is costing a third of what it does for their own office space. Is that simply the location factor that you're no longer in a high rental area?
That's in the major cities, actually. So when that has to do with a lot of overhead, I mean, but in terms of the major metropolitan U.S. cities, I should say, that's the case. Mm-hmm.
So as in having a co-work space in that same city, or as in going offshore?
Either way, quite honestly. My hunch is that if people who work in New York, for example, were gonna lived far enough that they were trying to avoid a commute and stay closer to home, but still needed to get out of their home to feel professional and, get that synergy with other people and have a community, because that's also very important. you might see something happening in suburbs, and I think that's really interesting. I think there are real implications for how we're going to plan cities once we stop, once we acknowledge that the physical tie to work, the need for that doesn't really exist. There's not a strong enough argument for that anymore.
Okay. Well, let's relate this back to expats, obviously, because of our podcast and the fact we focus on people looking to move overseas, countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Costa Rica, and those sorts of options. If somebody was basically planning to do this and approach their boss about the concept, I mean, obviously most people were probably a little bit fearful. What would be the best way to go about approaching them? Have you got any suggestions in terms of that? I mean, you've probably seen examples of it happening. Is it something that people, because I guess the big concern is everybody is, well, if I go and say this to my boss and he thinks I'm leaving, that might be my job gone. So, there's that little bit of a voice in the back of the head perhaps saying that, but is that a real fear? Is there a way they should approach it?
I think that's a real fear. I think talking about managing work and not people is a very cultural conversation. So it really depends on the culture of the organization you're in to begin with. But I've known of cases where you can try it on a trial basis and see how that goes. And once you've established, because there's learning on both ends, right? There's learning on the part of an employee as well as the employer in terms of how to manage that relationship. So if you can do it on a trial basis where try it out for 6 months where you're not going into the office, but you're close if needed. Mm-hmm. Can you, before you phase to an actual move? I think that's we're not there yet when we can say, yep, you can go to Costa Rica. I have not seen that but I lived in DC for nearly a decade, and living abroad wasn't uncommon, especially federal government, State Department. So it's possible. And I think we can do it if that's what makes us happy. It's just a matter of having the conversation. And also I would recommend the trial.
Yep.
Being local, but trying out. Mm-hmm,
I guess the question too is how much value are you bringing to the company, and the more value that you are contributing, the more likely they are to want to please you. Obviously, in the case I said before with Jackie Minchillo, she was valuable enough; they were happy to let her go. Mm-hmm. But there's actually almost a whole chapter, I think, dedicated in the Tim Ferriss book, 4 Hour Work Week, to how to make yourself not redundant, but how to basically make yourself location independent. And I certainly encourage people to have a read of that if they get the opportunity, because it sort of walks through that process, which is well worth looking at. You talk about the traditional worker versus the new worker as well. Do you want to just define what the difference is between the two types?
Certainly. So the traditional worker, it's the expectation is that there's hierarchy. Your career path is really moving from one stage to the next, and that's very upward. There is often you are managed as a person, so it's not uncommon to have a mentorship relationship, have a boss, have that rapport, and the work you do is very specific. You're very specialized often. I think what we're seeing with new workers is that your skills are more diverse, that it is less hierarchical. So often, a lot of people that we have coming into the workforce now have more technical skills than their managers and their supervisors. And I think that's really interesting because it's interesting in that conversation because there's a sense of, I know more. You still rely on content. A lot of the younger folks in the workforce that we're seeing, they have the skills. They don't necessarily yet have the content or the wisdom to understand how to apply it. So there's still that conversation, and I think they're both very valuable. But younger folks and just the millennials and that generation that we talk of pretty often in blanket statements, I think they're far more comfortable getting work done as opposed to being somewhere to hear the next.
Right.
What's my next task? What's my next dictum? So.
Well, that's it too. I guess you've kind of got to be entrepreneurial minded, don't you? Because if you're the type of person who does need constant direction, this isn't really going to work for you. If you have to go and check with your boss every 5 minutes what's required, it's not going to work for you. So it's kind of, you've got to be at a point where you mentioned diversity of skills. So I guess you need to make sure you are diverse in your skills. And if you currently aren't, maybe that's something to focus on. and secondly, become more independent in the way you work. That'd be a fair assumption. Is that probably the two main skills that people are going to need if they want to make this work for them?
I would say so. Yeah, you're going to have to be entrepreneurial, and you probably know this, Tony. You have to be entrepreneurial just in how do you get your technology to work, and like how are you gonna? This is very MacGyver-y at times, I would think.
That's why I'm hopeless. I can't get my technology to work.
Yeah. But yeah, I think everyone should ask. That's how I feel about it. And what's interesting is that what we're describing in terms of being entrepreneurial and being able to be agile and work in any environment and problem solve independently so that you don't need that constant physical interaction with people is actually the qualities that organizations want anyway. That's what they seek when they recruit. This isn't just about, you develop them because you want to be able to work, as an expat or in a different country, but those are actually the qualities that organizations probably hired you for. So you're honing the right skills.
Yeah. No, you're playing into their hands, so it works for everybody from that point of view. We've used the word co-working during this conversation. Do you want to just define that? Some people may not know exactly what co-working means and what co-working spaces are, but do you want to just explain that for listeners and viewers?
Yes, and this is something that I think different people have different definitions of it right now. Anyway, I think when WeWork is a very different co-working model than a local independent co-working space, but co-working is really a shared office facility, and it's frequented by entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, small businesses that work